Chem 110. This is Professor Tierney. So at this point you've watched a couple videos on gluten and you're starting to get an idea of what gluten is and how it functions in foods. So I just wanted to go over a few key points before you start your gluten assignment. So the first thing is that you saw in a previous video that gluten is formed when two wheat proteins, glutenin and gliadin, when they link up, and that happens when water is added. So that's why gluten only forms when you make a dough. It's not in the dry flour itself. Things to consider when you're making a food, whether you want more or less gluten formed, you should consider that you need enough water for it to form. So if you don't want as much gluten in a food, then you add just as much water as you need to moisten your dough. So foods that you want to be chewy, that you want to maybe have a more dense texture, that's when you want to really form that gluten. More delicate foods, more delicate baked goods like cupcakes, pie dough. These are foods where we don't want the gluten to form as much, whereas breads, bagels, we want lots of gluten to form because we want that chewy, tough texture. So things we should consider when we're making foods is the fact that water is an ingredient that's needed for gluten to form. So if you don't want as much gluten to form, you don't need to add as much water. Also, not all proteins develop gluten. So as you saw in the video, only certain grains contain glutenin and gliadin. Not all grains contain them. So you need to consider what type of grain you want to use. Gluten's role in foods are as such. So you saw that gluten, it really provides the structure to baked goods. So the more structure you want, the more gluten you want in that structure. It gives, in terms of mouthfeel, it gives foods a chewier structure, and it provides elasticity to that food so it can bounce back to its previous shape. So you'll notice if you poke your finger at like a French bread, it'll pop right back because of that gluten. If you do that to a cake, you're just going to poke a hole because there's not enough gluten to really bounce back to that same structure. It also holds in any gas or steam that develops in the process of leavening and allows the dough to expand. So in a future week, we're going to talk about leavening, and that is the process of introducing a gas into a food to make it lighter and more delicate. So once that gas is introduced, the gluten holds the gas in place in the food. So there are some things that we can consider if we want to increase or decrease the formation of gluten in foods. So if you want a food with a higher gluten content, some ways that you can increase that gluten formation is by using a flour with a higher protein content, such as bread flour. Mixing and kneading, the more kneading you do, the more those proteins link up. So you're really just making these large linkage, these large chains of proteins, and that's what gluten is. Also, interestingly enough, adding salt helps to increase the gluten formation in foods. Ways we can decrease the gluten formation is by adding a couple special ingredients. And these are the ingredients that we think of when we think of those more delicate foods. They tend to be sweeter and higher in fats or oils. That's because sugar and fats and oils actually decrease the gluten formation in foods. One of the most common ingredients in baked goods, actually a fat, is called shortening. Have you heard of shortening? That is what Crisco is. And it's called shortening because what happens is those molecules from the shortening, the fat, gets in the way of the gluten and the gliadin from bonding. So it actually shortens the chains of gluten being formed, and that's why it's called shortening. Now, I can't talk about gluten without talking about something called seitan. Seitan is a meat alternative that is 100% gluten. And it is one of my favorite foods. I love seitan. The texture, I don't know what it is about the texture, but I really love it. And so seitan is becoming a more popular meat alternative at many restaurants. And it's actually what was made in your second video that you watched when the scientist, he removed all of the other components of the wheat flour and he just had the gluten left over. That is the predecessor to seitan. So if you take that pure gluten and you really knead it up and then you cook it with some flavored broth, that gets you to seitan. So if you see seitan on a menu, know that it's just 100% gluten. So now that you've watched the videos on seitan, rather on gluten, now you can complete your Blackboard assignment for this folder.